Kate Doyle pressed her back against the cold wooden post of her porch, her chest heaving, her hands trembling so violently that the lantern she held cast wild shadows across the yard. The harvest moon hung low and fat above the Oklahoma territory, painting everything in shades of copper and blood, and the man standing 20 feet from her had just said the most terrifying and beautiful words anyone had ever spoken to her in her 26 years of living. "I have no land and no name," Emmett Bristol said, his voice low and steady, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "But I have 2 good hands." She stared at him. The corn stood tall and proud behind him, the harvest she had fought all summer to protect, the harvest that men with power and dark motives had tried 3 times to take from her. And here was this drifter, this stubborn, impossible, infuriating man she had known for exactly 47 days, offering himself to her as if he were something she had asked for. "That is supposed to mean something to me?" she asked, and even she could hear the way her voice cracked on the last syllable. "I think you know what it means, Kate." She turned away from him and stared out at the dark fields, at the rows of corn swaying in the September wind, and she felt something inside her chest break open like a dam that had been holding too long. She had built walls. She had mortared every crack with grief and stubbornness, and the particular kind of pride that frontier women learn to wear like armor. And then Emmett Bristol had wandered up her road 47 days ago with nothing but a bedroll and a pair of worn-out boots, and he had spent 6 weeks quietly dismantling every single one of those walls without even seeming to try. But she was not a woman who fell easily. She was not a woman who forgot. She knew about his dark past. She had heard the rumors, and the secrets he was still keeping from her felt like a trap she was walking into with her eyes open. She turned back to face him. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "Right now, before this goes one breath further." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something raw and old moving behind those steady eyes. He reached up slowly and pulled his hat from his head, holding it against his chest. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "All right, Kate, let me tell you everything." And so it began the way most honest things begin in the Wild West, not with ease, not with safety, but with 2 people standing in the moonlight, choosing the terrifying path of truth. 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of August of 1881, Kate Doyle had been in the middle of an argument with the bank. The bank, in this case, was represented by a man named Gerald Hooper, who was the regional agent for the First National Bank of Cimarron, and who had ridden out to her farm with a leather satchel full of papers, and a manner that suggested he found the whole business deeply unpleasant. He sat at her kitchen table while she stood over him with her arms crossed, and he laid out the numbers very carefully, as though she were simple. The farm had belonged to her father, Patrick Doyle, who had come out from Illinois 17 years ago to stake his claim in the Oklahoma territory. He had built the house with his own hands, broken the first ground himself, planted the first season himself, and raised Kate and her younger brother Thomas on the sweat of his belief that this land would provide. 3 years ago, Patrick Doyle had died of a fever in the late spring, leaving Kate the deed, the debt, and the determination. Thomas had gone east a year after that, deciding the frontier life was not for him, and Kate had stayed alone because it had never once occurred to her to do anything else. But the summer of 1881 had been cruel. A dry spring had stunted the early crops. A hailstorm in June had ruined half her wheat. She had borrowed against the farm to buy seed corn for the second planting, and now Gerald Hooper was telling her, very politely, that if she could not demonstrate sufficient harvest yield by the end of September, the bank would be forced to reclaim the property. "You have had quite an unfortunate run of luck, Miss Doyle," Hooper said, not unkindly. "I have had quite an unfortunate run of people working against me," Kate said. Hooper blinked. "I beg your pardon." She had not meant to say that aloud. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Someone has been interfering with my land, Mr. Hooper. My irrigation ditch was blocked twice this summer. I found my fence cut on the north pasture in July. Someone pulled 2 rows of my corn seedlings in the night back in late May. She laid her hands flat on the table. This is not bad luck, this is sabotage. Hooper was quiet for a moment. He looked at his papers. Miss Doyle, I understand that farming alone is difficult, and sometimes when we are under great strain, we can see patterns where there are none. She looked at him with an expression that would have stopped a charging horse. I have been farming this land for 3 years alone, Mr. Hooper. I know the difference between a drought and a cut fence. He left 20 minutes later, taking his satchel and his doubt with him, and Kate stood in her yard watching his buggy roll down the road, and she felt the weight of everything settle across her shoulders like an iron yoke. She knew who was behind the sabotage. She had known for months. His name was Clem Rudd, and he owned the 3,000 acres that bordered her farm on the east and the south. He had made her an offer for her land in April, a low and insulting offer that she had declined without ceremony, and since then things had started going wrong with a regularity that was not coincidental. Clem Rudd was a man who got what he wanted by making the alternative too painful to bear, and his dark motives were as transparent as spring water to anyone willing to look. But knowing and proving were 2 different things in the Oklahoma Territory in 1881, and without proof, she had nothing. She was standing there still, staring at the empty road, when she heard the sound of boots on her path and looked over to see a man walking up from the south road. He was tall and lean, wearing a coat that had seen better years, carrying a bedroll over one shoulder and a canvas bag over the other. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and he walked with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had been walking for a very long time and had made a certain peace with it. He stopped at the edge of her yard and looked at her. "Morning," he said. "This is private land," she said. "I know it. I saw your sign." He tilted his head toward the road. "Wondered if you had any work that needed doing. I'm good with my hands and I eat less than you'd think." Kate looked at him the way she had learned to look at everything on the frontier, with clear eyes and no sentimentality. He had the look of a man who had been moving for a long time. There was dust in his coat and something more difficult to name in his eyes, a kind of tiredness that did not come from walking but from something older and harder. He was probably 29 or 30, she guessed. He was not soft. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Any kind that needs doing. I've broken horses, mended fences, built barns, cleared land, harvested grain, and everything in between." He glanced past her at the fields. "Looks like you've got corn coming in. Not for another 5 weeks. Which means you've got 5 weeks of work before the harvest." She studied him for another moment. She needed help. She had needed help all summer and had been too proud and too worried about trusting anyone to hire it. Her corn was growing, the second planting had taken hold, and if nothing went wrong between now and September, she might actually have enough yield to satisfy the bank. But 5 weeks was a long time for things to go wrong when someone like Clem Rudd was determined to make them. "What's your name?" she asked. Something moved briefly across his face, not quite a flinch. More like the quick adjustment of a man choosing how to answer. "Emmett Bristol," he said. "Where are you from?" "Emmett Bristol, here and there. That tells me nothing." "I know it," he said, and there was something so simple and unapologetic about the way he said it that she almost wanted to smile. "I pay a fair wage," she said instead. "I have a bunkhouse. I expect a full day's work every day and I expect honesty. You cause me trouble, I'll send you down the road without a second thought. Understood?" "Understood," he said. "I'm Kate Doyle. The farm is mine. What happens here is my decision and nobody else's." She paused. "There are things going on at this farm that are complicated. If you're going to work here, you'll find out some of it eventually. I'd rather you hear it from me than from someone in town." He waited, not pushing, just listening. "A man named Clem Rudd wants my land and he's not being polite about it," she said. "If you work for me, you may end up in the middle of that. I want you to know that before you say yes." Emmett Bristol was quiet for a moment. He looked out at her fields, at the green corn standing in the August heat, and then he looked back at her. "I've been in the middle of things before," he said simply. "She hired him. The first week, they existed in a careful orbit around each other. Kate was not a woman who trusted easily, and she was not a woman who explained herself, and she watched Emmett Bristol work with the detached assessment of someone determined not to be fooled. But there was nothing to catch him in. He rose before dawn and he worked until the light failed, and he worked with a focused and capable quietness that she found, reluctantly, very competent. He repaired the irrigation ditch without being asked, reinforcing the embankments with stones from the creek bed, so that whoever had blocked it before would have a harder time doing it again. He restrung the cut fence on the north pasture, and then extended it 100 feet further than its original line, covering a gap she had not even noticed. He found where the corn seedlings had been pulled and replanted the rows with his own hands, patting the earth down with a care that she observed from a distance and said nothing about. He was not a talkative man, but he was not a silent one either. In the evenings when the work was done, and Kate brought supper out to the yard table under the old pecan tree, they ate together and talked sometimes about practical things, the soil, the weather, the expected yield. Occasionally he said something that surprised her, something that suggested a mind that had read and thought more than a drifter's life would obviously account for. On the 7th evening she asked him directly. "You have schooling," she said. It was not a question. He looked up from his plate. "Some. More than some, I think." He considered that. "I read a lot," he said finally. "You can get far on reading." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. She noted the evasion and filed it away. On the 10th day, Clem Rudd came. He came in the afternoon with 2 of his hands riding behind him, which was not subtle and not meant to be. Rudd was a heavy-set man in his middle 40s with a prosperous mustache and the manner of a man who had been told yes so many times that no had begun to sound like a foreign language. He rode up to where Kate was working at the edge of the south field and stopped his horse and looked down at her. "Miss Doyle," he said pleasantly, "I see you've got hired help." "I see you've got eyes," she said. He smiled. He had a smile that he wore like a tool. "I've been thinking about my offer," he said. "I've been thinking that perhaps I was not generous enough. I'd like to revise my numbers. I declined your offer, Mr. Rudd. People change their minds. I do not." He glanced past her at Emmett, who had stopped what he was doing and was standing with a post-hole digger in his hands, watching the exchange with calm attention. Something shifted in Rudd's expression, a small tightening around the eyes. "New man," Rudd said. "My business," Kate said. Rudd brought his gaze back to her, and for just a moment the pleasant mask slipped and she saw what was underneath it, not rage exactly, but something colder. Calculation. The look of a man adjusting his plans. "September is coming fast," he said. "I hope the harvest is kind to you, Miss Doyle." He turned his horse and rode away with his men, and Kate stood in the sun and watched him go and felt the familiar cold certainty settle in her chest. He was not done. Whatever came next would be worse than a blocked ditch or a cut fence. That evening Emmett came to her as she sat on the porch and said, "You should tell me more about Rudd." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because knowing the shape of a threat is the first step to managing it," he said. She told him. She told him everything, from the first offer to the series of incidents to Gerald Hooper's visit. Emmett listened without interrupting, leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed, and when she was finished he was quiet for a long moment. "He's running out of time too," Emmett said. "He knows your harvest window. Whatever he plans, he'll do it in the next 4 weeks. "I know," Kate said. "You need to document everything," he said. "Every incident, every visit, every witness. If you can build a pattern, you have something." She looked at him with a new kind of attention. "That's a particular way of thinking about it," he shrugged. "It's a practical way." "It's a legal way," she said. "You know something about law." The small, careful adjustment crossed his face again. "I know something about a lot of things," he said, and then he went inside before she could press further. The second week brought a new development. Kate rode into the town of Millhaven to sell eggs and pick up supplies, and while she was at the dry goods store, she overheard 2 men talking at the counter, not quite low enough, about a drifter who had ridden through Cimarron 2 months ago, a man who had been involved in something down in Texas. The name they used was Bristol. She bought her supplies without showing her expression and rode home thinking very carefully. That evening she asked Emmett directly. She set his supper in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "I heard something in town today." He was still. "About a man named Bristol," she said, "down in Texas, about something he was involved in." He set down his fork. He looked at her and she saw it then, the thing she had been sensing under the surface, the weight of something he was carrying that he had not put down. "What did you hear?" he asked. "I heard that a man named Bristol was involved in some kind of trouble in Texas. I did not hear the particulars." She kept her eyes on his. "I want the particulars from you." He was quiet for a very long time. Outside the window, the wind moved through the corn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Then Emmett Bristol folded his hands on the table and told her. His real name was Emmett Bristol, and it was the only name he had, though it was not a name he had been known by in certain places for the past 2 years. He had come from a small town in East Texas where his family, his father and mother and younger sister, had worked a farm not so different from this one. When he was 25, his father had gotten caught up in a land dispute with a man who made Clem Rudd look gentle, a cattle baron named Harlan Voss who ran the county through intimidation and bribery, and when necessary, violence. Emmett had gone to the county seat to file papers on his father's behalf and had been intercepted by 2 of Voss's men and beaten badly, and told to go home and forget about it. He had not forgotten about it. He had instead gone to find a lawyer and spent 3 months building a case, and when they had finally taken Harlan Voss to court, Voss had walked free because 3 witnesses had been paid to change their testimony. Emmett had stood in that courtroom and watched justice fail in a way that had fundamentally altered something in him. What happened next, he said, was where things became complicated. He had found out, through careful and patient investigation that had taken him the better part of a year, that one of the false witnesses was a man named Dooley who lived outside of Abilene and who was terrified of what he had done and what Voss might still do to him. Emmett had gone to Dooley and persuaded him to come forward with the truth, but in the process of getting Dooley to the authorities, they had been intercepted by 2 of Voss's hired hands. There had been a confrontation. Emmett had not started it, but he had finished it, and one of Voss's men had ended up with a broken arm and the other had ended up in jail. But Voss had considerable influence with the law in that county, and the story that got told was not entirely the story that had happened, and Emmett had found himself in the position of being a man that certain people in certain parts of Texas had reasons to be unhappy with. He had not done anything that a reasonable person would call wrong. But the law, as he had learned by then, and justice were not always the same thing. He had been moving since. Not running, he was careful to say. Moving. There was a difference, though he understood that from the outside it might not look like one. Kate listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "And your family?" she asked. "Your father's farm?" Something crossed his face that was more than tiredness. "My father died before it was settled," he said. "My mother lives with my sister now. My sister married a man in Galveston. They're all right." He paused. "The farm is gone. Voss got it in the end." She looked at him. She saw the grief there and the anger that had been living with the grief long enough to become something quieter, and she saw the stubborn determination of a man who had refused to be destroyed by what he had lost. She recognized it because she had been walking alongside the same things herself. "You should have told me this before I hired you," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that. Is there anyone looking for you?" "Nothing official," he said. "Voss has people who would like to find me. But they're not law, and Voss is occupied with other troubles these days. I've been keeping track." She considered him for a long time. "You understand why I need to think about this," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She thought about it for 3 days. She watched him work. She thought about what he had told her and tested it against what she had observed of him, and she thought about the way he had reinforced her irrigation ditch and replanted her corn and stood in the field watching Rudd's men with that calm, unwavering attention. She thought about the fact that he had told her the truth when pressed, even though the truth was complicated and cost him. On the third day she came to where he was working and said, "You can stay." He looked at her. "You sure?" "I would not say it if I were not sure," she said. Something shifted in his expression, something small but significant, like a door opening a crack. "Thank you, Kate," he said. It was the first time he had used only her first name without the formal address, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in wind direction before a storm. The third week of August brought the incident with the creek. Kate had been checking the irrigation that morning when she found it. Someone had poured a chemical into the upper creek, something caustic. She could tell by the smell and the dead fish floating near the bank. If the tainted water had flowed into her irrigation channels, it would have poisoned the corn at a critical stage in its development, killing the harvest that was now only 3 weeks from being ready. She had caught it in time. Barely. She was standing at the creek bank with her heart hammering and her fists clenched when Emmett arrived at a run, having seen her from the far field. He assessed the situation in seconds. "How far has it spread?" "To the first fork," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "I blocked the intake channel before it got further." He crouched by the water and looked at it, then stood. "Someone did this last night. The current would have carried it to your field by dawn." He looked at her. "If you hadn't come out early this morning, I know," she said. He looked at her face. He saw the anger there and the fear underneath it, and something happened in his expression, something that was protective and fierce in a way that startled her. "I'm going to find out who did this," he said. "I know who did this," she said. "The problem is proving it. Then we prove it." He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided something. "This is 2 steps too far, Kate. We're not waiting for the next thing he tries." Together they spent that day documenting the creek incident as carefully as they could, collecting water samples in glass jars from her kitchen, marking the location and extent of the contamination, writing down times and observations. Emmett rode into Millhaven and came back with a man named Dr. Aldous Crane, who was a retired physician with enough scientific knowledge to look at the water samples and confirm in writing that they had been chemically altered with lye. Kate added that document to the folder she had been building, which now contained 3 written accounts of fence cutting, 2 accounts of irrigation interference, and the earlier testimony about the seedlings. Emmett sat with her at the kitchen table that evening and they organized it all, and when they were done he said, "You need to take this to the territorial marshal." "The territorial marshal is in Cimarron," she said. "He's a good man, but he can't be everywhere. Rudd knows that." "Then we take it to the county judge," Emmett said. "Directly. We don't go through the bank or the local constable. We go to the judge with this documentation, and we ask for an injunction against interference with your property." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them cast a warm, unsteady light. "You know a great deal about legal procedure for a man who claims he just read a lot," she said. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. "I spent a year trying to protect my father's farm, remember. You learn the system when the system is what stands between you and losing everything." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked down at the papers. "All right," she said. "We ride to Cimarron tomorrow." They rode to Cimarron the following morning, Kate in her good dress and Emmett in his cleanest shirt, and they waited 3 hours in the antechamber of the county courthouse to see Judge Harmon Bales, who was a thin man with sharp eyes and a reputation for impartiality that was the main reason Kate had decided to trust him. Judge Bales read through every document in the folder while they sat across from his desk. He asked clarifying questions. He was thorough and he was precise, and he did not talk down to Kate, which she noted with appreciation. When he was finished, he set the papers down and looked at them both. "This is a compelling pattern of evidence," he said, "but the direct connection to Clement Rudd is circumstantial." "He has made multiple offers for my land," Kate said. "Each incident of sabotage has occurred after a refused offer. Documented?" the judge asked. "I have witnesses to 2 of his visits," Kate said. "I am one of them," Emmett said. The judge looked at Emmett with a measuring expression. "And you are?" "Emmett Bristol. I work Miss Doyle's farm." The judge looked back and forth between them and then returned to his papers. "I cannot issue an injunction naming Rudd directly without more specific evidence of his involvement," he said. "But I can issue a general order of protection for your property, Miss Doyle, which would require any incident of interference to be reported directly to this court, and would establish a documented record that would be very useful in any future proceeding." He paused. "I can also make certain informal inquiries. Clement Rudd has been the subject of complaint before." It was not everything Kate had hoped for, but it was something real, something she could hold on to. She thanked the judge, and as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright August noon, Emmett looked at her and said, "It's a foundation." "It's a beginning," she corrected. He almost smiled again. "That's what I said." They rode back to the farm in the golden afternoon light, and for the first time in months Kate felt something loosen slightly in her chest, the particular suffocation of feeling entirely alone against a threat that was larger than she was. She was still largely alone, but not entirely. She glanced sideways at Emmett as they rode. He was looking at the road ahead, his profile clean against the sky, and she noticed for the first time, or perhaps allowed herself to notice for the first time, that he was a handsome man. Not in the uncomplicated way of men who had easy lives. Handsome in the way that some men become when they have been tested and have not broken, when the difficulty has carved something essential out of the softness and left something that is honest and strong. She looked away from him and focused on the road. That evening she was washing up after supper, and he was on the porch, and she could hear him through the open window, moving quietly, and she stood at her basin and thought about something that frightened her considerably more than Clem Rudd. The fourth week was quiet in the way that the stillness before a storm is quiet. Kate and Emmett worked the days toward harvest, checking the corn daily, managing the water carefully, and the atmosphere between them changed slowly in the way that things change when two people spend long days working close together toward a shared goal. They began to fall into an easy rhythm, the particular communication of two capable people who have learned each other's methods. He would start a task, and she would know what he needed next without being told. She would assess a problem aloud, and he would hear the gap in her reasoning and fill it quietly. They argued sometimes, with a direct and honest heat that felt very different from the arguments she had had with her father, which had always involved something held back. With Emmett, she found she could say exactly what she thought, and he would consider it and respond in kind. And sometimes she was right, and sometimes he was, and neither of them felt the need to make it anything more than what it was. Two people working toward the truth. One evening she came out of the barn to find him sitting on the fence rail watching the sunset, and the orange light was falling across his face, and she stopped without meaning to, and just looked at him for a moment before he turned and saw her. She walked past without saying anything and went inside and stood in her kitchen, and recognized with great clarity that she was in trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with Clem Rudd. She was 30 years old. She had been in love once before, or thought she had, with a young man in her early 20s before she had come out to the territory, and that had ended in a quiet and mutual disappointment that had not broken her heart so much as clarified it, shown her the particular shape of what she was actually looking for, which was something she had not found in anyone since. She had decided some time ago that the farm and her independence and her work were sufficient. She had built a life that she controlled and that she believed in, and she was not a woman inclined to put any of that into another person's hands. The problem, which she identified with the same clear and pitiless honesty that she applied to everything, was that Emmett Bristol did not seem to want her to put anything into his hands. He had not been chasing her. He had not been performing. He had simply been exactly and quietly what he was, every single day, and that was more dangerous than any amount of deliberate pursuit. She put it aside. She had a harvest to manage. The first week of September arrived, and with it the scent of change in the air, the particular sharpness of coming autumn that meant the corn was ready or nearly so. Kate walked the rows every morning now, checking the ears, feeling the weight of them, making the calculations that would determine whether she had enough yield to satisfy Gerald Hooper and the First National Bank of Cimarron. The numbers were close, not comfortable but possible. On the 5th of September, Emmett came to find her in the field and said, "There were men on the South Road last night." She straightened. "What men?" "Two of them on horseback. They rode past twice. I was watching from the bunkhouse." "Rudd's men." "I couldn't see faces in the dark, but they were watching the farm." He paused. "I think he's planning something for the harvest itself, waiting until the corn is ready and then hitting it." Kate felt cold. Destroying ripe corn was something a determined enemy could do quickly and devastatingly, fire or trampling or any of a dozen methods that would leave her with nothing to show the bank in 3 weeks. "We need people here," she said. "Yes," he said, "people you trust." She thought of her neighbors. There were 2 families within reasonable riding distance who she had a cordial relationship with, the Harpers to the north and the Purcell family 3 miles west. She had helped them in smaller ways over the years, and they had returned the kindness when they could. She rode out that afternoon and spoke to Joseph Harper and Ben Purcell, and explained the situation plainly, and both men, after listening with the grave and practical attention of frontier farmers who understood what losing a harvest meant, agreed to help. They established a watch rotation, 2 people at a time through the night, covering the main approaches to the farm. Emmett had arranged them in overlapping fields of view so that anyone approaching from any direction would be seen before they reached the corn. Kate loaded her father's old Winchester and kept it by her bed. On the 3rd night of the watch they came. It was just past 2 in the morning when Joseph Harper's son Caleb sounded the alarm, a series of 3 sharp whistle blasts that brought everyone to their feet. Kate was out of her bed and on the porch before she was fully awake, Winchester in hand, and she could see in the moonlight 2 figures moving fast along the south fence line carrying something. Emmett was already there, having come from the bunkhouse at the first whistle. He did not hesitate. He moved to intercept, not with aggression but with positioning, cutting off the direct route to the cornfield, and Kate came around the far side of the house to cover the other approach, and between them and the Harper boy coming up from the South Road, the 2 intruders found themselves with nowhere to go. They stopped. One of them dropped what he was carrying, which turned out to be a tin of kerosene, the sound of it hitting the ground loud and final in the night silence. Kate looked at the 2 men in the moonlight. She did not know them by name, but she had seen them before, at a distance, riding with Rudd's outfit. She kept the Winchester level and steady. "You are on my property," she said. "With kerosene. In the middle of the night. This is the last poor decision you will make tonight." The men were smart enough to know when the calculation had changed. They were disarmed and held until morning, when Kate rode to Millhaven for the constable, and the constable took one look at the kerosene tin and the circumstantial evidence, and said it was out of his authority and complicated, which was exactly what Kate had expected. But she had Caleb Harper and Emmett Bristol and Ben Purcell's second son as witnesses to what had been found, and she wrote it all down, and she sent a report directly to Judge Bales in Cimarron by the same morning's post. 2 days later, a deputy from Cimarron came to Clem Rudd's property with papers. Kate did not see it happen, but she heard about it from Joseph Harper, who had heard from someone in town, and what she heard was that Rudd had turned red as a beet and sent a lawyer to Cimarron within the day. The wheels of justice in the Oklahoma Territory in 1881 were slow, but they turned, and the particular combination of documented evidence and the attempted arson had given Judge Bales what he needed to open a formal investigation into Clement Rudd's activities. It would not be resolved quickly, but it would be resolved, and in the meantime, Rudd's own lawyer had advised him very strongly to cease and desist any activity that could be construed as interference with Kate Doyle's property. The night after the constable's visit, Kate sat on her porch in the September dark and felt something very close to relief move through her, cautious and tentative but real. The corn was 10 days from harvest. The legal situation was moving in the right direction. The farm was safe, or safer than it had been all summer. She heard Emmett come out and settle into the other chair, and for a while they sat in companionable silence. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "I was thinking," she said, "about Rudd. About all of it," she said. "About what happens after the harvest." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" he asked. She turned to look at him. In the darkness she could see the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the way he was looking at the stars with that steady, unhurried attention he gave to everything. She thought about the fact that there was nothing keeping him here once the harvest was done. A drifter who had come looking for work would leave when the work was finished. That was the nature of things. "I mean that after the harvest the immediate crisis will be resolved," she said, very carefully. "And I'm trying to think about what comes next." She paused. "For the farm." He was quiet for a moment. "The farm will be all right," he said. "The yield will cover the bank's requirements. The legal case against Rudd will give you some protection going forward." "That's not quite what I was asking," she said. Another pause, longer this time. "Kate," he said, and his voice was different, quieter. "You're going to leave," she said. It was not an accusation. She said it the way she said everything, directly and without performance. "I hadn't decided that," he said. She looked at him. "What had you decided?" He turned to meet her gaze, and in the starlight his eyes were very dark and very direct. "I haven't been able to decide much of anything since about the 3rd week I was here," he said, "which is a new experience for me." She felt something shift in her chest, warm and dangerous. "Emmett," she said. "I know you don't want this complicated," he said. "I don't know what I want," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years, and saying it frightened her so thoroughly that she stood up from the chair and went inside, and she lay in her bed for a very long time staring at the dark ceiling before she slept. The harvest came on the 15th of September, which was a Saturday, and the whole territory seemed to exhale with it, the particular collective relief of communities where everything depends on what the land gives back. Kate had arranged for Harper and Purcell men to come help bring in the corn, which was the way of frontier farming, the sharing of labor for large tasks, and they came in the morning with their wagons and their hands and their easy working company. Emmett worked beside her all day in the rows, and the work was hard and hot and deeply satisfying, the kind of work that is its own complete argument for the value of living. Kate pulled ears and carried and counted, and her body ached, and her heart was full of something she could not quite name, the feeling of having held on through everything, and arrived at the moment when holding on had been enough. By afternoon the count was clear. She had exceeded the bank's required yield by nearly 12%. She stood in her yard with her arms aching and her face dirty and her hair escaping every pin she had put in it, and she looked at the piled corn in her wagon and felt a joy so fierce and uncomplicated that it moved through her like light. The Harper and Purcell families stayed for supper, which became a proper harvest celebration with food and laughter and children running in the yard, and the September evening was warm and golden and soft, and Kate moved through it feeling more alive than she had in years. It was after the families had gone and the yard was quiet, and the moon was rising, huge and copper-colored over the cornfields, that Emmett found her standing at the edge of her field. She heard him come up behind her and she did not turn around. She was watching the moonlight on the corn and trying to hold the feeling of the day inside her. 12% over, he said. 13, actually, she said. I miscounted the far row earlier. 13, he said. He came to stand beside her. Gerald Hooper is going to have to find something else to worry about. She smiled at the field. Yes, she said. They stood in silence for a moment and then he said, Kate. She turned to look at him. He was standing very close, closer than the usual respectful distance he maintained, and he had his hat in his hands and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open and unguarded and entirely honest. I have no land, he said, and I have no name that means much in these parts. I have no family farm and no fortune and no particular standing." He paused. "But I have two good hands." He looked at them briefly, those work-roughed and capable hands, and then back at her. "And I have a great deal of feeling for this place. And for you," another pause, the kind that costs something to allow. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm only asking you not to decide against me before you've had a chance to think about it." Kate looked at him. She thought about walls, and about the year she had spent building them, and the 6 weeks he had spent not exactly dismantling them, but simply persisting against them until they had started to feel less necessary. She thought about his honesty and his steadiness, and the way he had stood in her field watching Rudd's men with that quiet, unshakable attention. She thought about his dark past and his father's lost farm, and the year he had spent trying to get justice for his family, and she thought about how none of those things had made him bitter, only careful. She thought about his two good hands. She thought about herself, 26 years old, standing in her father's corn field on a September night with 13% more yield than she needed and more feeling in her chest than she knew what to do with. "I have been thinking about it," she said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks." He was very still. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said. "You decided you were going to fix every broken thing on this farm without being asked and without announcing it, and you never stopped, and I would very much like to know if you plan to apply that same stubbornness to everything else." "I usually do," he said, and for the first time she heard the warmth underneath his steadiness, the particular warmth of a man who is deeply and irreversibly fond of someone. "Then I think," she said very carefully, "that we should talk about what comes next." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like that very much." They talked for 2 hours on the porch that night, the honest and complicated conversation of two people who have learned not to pretend. And at the end of it, they had not made any dramatic declarations, but they had made something better, a clear and mutual understanding of where they each stood and what they each hoped for, and what they were each afraid of. Kate said she was not interested in pretending that her fear of trusting someone with the farm, with herself, was not real. Emmett said he was not interested in pretending that his drifting had not been partly about running from the grief of what he had lost. They were honest about these things in the way that was uncomfortable and necessary, and when they were finished they sat for a while in the quiet and the moonlight. "You could stay," Kate said at last, "properly, not as hired help." He looked at her. "Properly means what?" She felt warmth move up her face in a way she found very undignified. "It means we see what this is," she said. "With intentions, with honesty, and with patience, because I don't do anything quickly." "I noticed," he said, and there was a smile in his voice, a real one. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said, "properly, with intentions and honesty and all the patience you need." October came, and with it the cooling of the air and the settling of the dust, and the beginning of something between them that was slow and careful and increasingly incandescent. They were deliberate about it in the way that two serious people are deliberate, not holding back their feeling but being thoughtful about where they placed it. They talked a great deal. They worked side by side every day with the comfortable rhythm that had been building since August, and now there was something additional woven through it, the awareness of the other person as something more than a capable partner, as someone who was becoming essential. He brought her things he found, small and practical things, a particularly smooth stone from the creek bed, a hawk feather he had found near the north fence, once a bunch of late wildflowers from the edge of the property that he handed to her without ceremony, just set them on the kitchen table when she wasn't looking, and she found them and stood with them in her hands for a moment and felt her throat tighten. She did not say anything to him about it, but she put them in a glass of water on the windowsill, and they stayed there until they faded, and then she pressed one between the pages of her father's Bible. He started teaching himself the farm's particular rhythms and needs with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything. He had a gift for understanding systems, land and water and soil, the way it all worked together, and Kate found herself explaining things to him, and then watching him take those explanations and build on them, connecting things she had learned through years of experience to principles she had never thought to articulate. He was learning the farm because he intended to stay, and she knew that he knew that she knew it, and none of them, including her, needed to say it aloud yet. She wrote to her brother Thomas in the third week of October. She wrote about the harvest and about the legal case against Rudd, which was proceeding with the slow, grinding certainty that the territorial justice system managed when it actually engaged. And at the end of her letter, she wrote about Emmett in 3 sentences that were very precise and revealed considerably more than 3 sentences usually could. Thomas wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast for the mail, and his response said mostly practical things about the farm and the legal case, and then at the very end, in his familiar handwriting, he wrote, "I'm glad you have someone there, Kate. Just be sure he's worth your stubbornness." She had to smile at that. Thomas knew her very well. In November, the legal case reached a significant moment. Judge Bales, after 2 months of investigation, and the testimony of the 2 men who had been caught with the kerosene, and who had been persuaded by the prospect of prison time to explain who had sent them, issued a formal finding against Clement Rudd. Rudd was ordered to pay Kate Doyle restitution for documented losses from his interference, which amounted to more money than she had expected, a sum that would have been enough to pay off the remainder of her debt to the First National Bank of Cimarron. He was also formally prohibited from making any contact with her property for a period of 5 years, with the understanding that any further interference would result in criminal charges. Rudd tried to fight it, and his lawyer tried to fight it, and it came to nothing, because the documentation was thorough, and the witnesses were credible, and Judge Bales was the kind of man who disliked being made a fool of, and Rudd had pushed too far. Kate received the news on a gray November morning and sat very still for a while and then went to find Emmett in the barn. She told him. He listened to the whole of it, and when she finished he said, "It's done then." "It's done," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and then she did something she had not done with another person in a very long time. She let herself feel it entirely without the armor. She let the relief and the triumph and the grief of how hard it had been all wash through her at once, and her eyes filled with tears that she did not try to stop. He crossed the distance between them and held her, and she let him, standing in the cold barn with her face against his shoulder, and he was solid and warm and real, and she thought, standing there, that this was one of the most honest moments she had ever existed inside. They were married in January of 1882. It was a small ceremony because Kate did not see the need for a large one, and because the January in the Oklahoma Territory was cold, and the roads from Cimarron were uncertain. The minister came out from Millhaven on a Thursday afternoon, and Joseph Harper and his wife, Clara, and Ben Purcell and his wife, Margaret, stood as witnesses, and the ceremony was held in Kate's parlor, with the winter sun coming through the windows, and the wood stove making the room warm and amber-colored. Kate wore her mother's blue dress, which she had kept in the cedar chest since her mother's death 12 years ago, and it fit her well enough with some alteration, and she had put her hair up carefully and added a small spray of dried lavender from last summer's kitchen garden. She was not a woman who paid excessive attention to her appearance, but she understood that some moments deserved to be marked, and she stood in her parlor and looked at Emmett standing across from her in his clean white shirt and a borrowed coat that fit him reasonably, and she felt something settle in her that had been restless for years. The minister was a young man named Reverend Price, who took his work seriously and read the vows with dignity and asked them each to repeat the words, and Kate said them clearly and without hesitation and watched Emmett say them in return and believed every word of what she heard. Afterwards, Clara Harper had brought food enough for a proper celebration, and they ate and talked and laughed in the small, warm parlor while the winter wind moved outside, and Kate Bristol, who had been Kate Doyle for 26 years and had liked the sound of her own name, found that she did not mind the change at all. That night, lying in the dark of her room, which was now their room, with the cold pressing against the windows and the fire burning low, she said to him, "You never told me about your middle name." She felt him smile against the top of her head. "James," he said. "Emmett James Bristol." "That's a good name," she said. "It'll do," he said. She listened to him breathe in the dark. "I thought you might leave," she said. "After the harvest, I thought you would decide the complications were not worth it." "I told you," he said, "I'm stubborn." "I have noticed," she said. Spring came early and warm in 1882, and with it, the work of the farm resumed with a new quality, the quality of work shared by people who have made a permanent choice toward each other. Emmett brought his full, considerable competence to the planning of the season, and Kate, who had been managing alone long enough to know every nuance of her land, found that two capable minds brought to the same problems produced solutions neither would have reached independently. They expanded the corn planting. They added a section of winter wheat that Emmett had researched in an agricultural bulletin he had ordered from Kansas City. They repaired the barn roof completely for the first time in years and built a new storage structure for the grain. Kate taught him the specific character of the soil in each section of the farm, the way the east field drained slowly and needed different management in wet years, the way the light hit the south pasture, and how it affected the growing season, the particular stubbornness of the clay near the creek bank. He listened with the whole of his attention, the way he did everything, and he asked questions that showed he was thinking well beyond the immediate answers. In April, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before breakfast, matter-of-factly, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, because she was not a woman who managed important news with elaborate staging. He stopped what he was doing, which was cutting bread, and looked at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on him before, entirely unguarded, entirely astonished, and something that was too large to name moving behind his eyes. "Kate," he said. "I know," she said, and smiled despite herself. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her with such tender and careful feeling that she had to grip his shirt to keep herself steady. And then he held her, and she held him in the morning kitchen with the spring light coming through the window. And she thought about her father who had built this kitchen and her mother who had loved it. And she thought about everything that had been lost and everything that was being made new. And she was overwhelmingly grateful for the specific and irreplaceable stubbornness of Emmett Bristol. She wrote to Thomas that afternoon. The summer of 1882 was warm and productive and uncomplicated in the ways that mattered. The legal situation with Rudd had resolved into a distant and permanent settlement, and Rudd himself, faced with the financial penalties and the formal prohibition and the loss of any ability to pursue the Doyle farm, had sold a portion of his own land and removed himself to Cimarron, where he was reported to have taken up a less aggressive form of commerce. Kate did not waste energy on either satisfaction or mercy in that direction. She simply went on. Her body changed through the summer with the particular authority of a woman growing a new life, and she found that she was not afraid of it the way she had half expected to be, having been so long accustomed to self-sufficiency. Emmett was careful with her without being treating her as fragile, which was the exact right calibration, and she appreciated it more than she said, though she thought he could probably tell. In August, 1 year after his arrival on her road, they sat on the porch in the evening, the exact configuration they had shared so many times before, and she thought about all that had happened in 12 months and all that was about to happen, and she felt a depth of contentment that she would not have known how to recognize a year ago because she had not yet felt it. "I think about my father's farm," Emmett said that evening, unprompted. It was the first time in months he had raised it. She looked at him. "What do you think about it?" "I think about what it cost him," he said, "and what it cost my family, and I think about the fact that the people who took it counted on us not fighting back." He paused, "and I think about the fact that here we fought back." "We did," she said. "Your father built something worth fighting for," he said. "He did," she said, And then, because it was true and because it was time to say it, she said, "And so did I, and so have we." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat in the August dark while the corn grew behind them, and the child grew inside her, and the Oklahoma Territory went on being exactly what it was: vast and indifferent and occasionally brutal and occasionally heartbreakingly beautiful. Their son was born on a morning in late October of 1882, 6 weeks before Kate had calculated, which startled everyone, including the doctor who came from Millhaven and who managed the situation with competent anxiety. The birth was difficult in the way that first births sometimes are, long and exhausting and punctuated by moments that frightened Emmett in ways that nothing else had frightened him, and he stayed close the whole time, a steady and unobtrusive presence that Kate found essential. The baby arrived at dawn, small and loud and entirely determined about existing, and the doctor pronounced him healthy and left by mid-morning, and Kate lay in the bed with her son on her chest and watched Emmett hold the baby's hand in 2 fingers, one large and rough against something so small and new, and his expression was one she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They named him Patrick James Bristol, for Kate's father and for Emmett's middle name, and when the name was settled and the baby was sleeping and the house was quiet and cold and golden in the October afternoon light, Kate looked at Emmett across the room and said, "Well, well," he said, and smiled, and it was the full smile, not the restrained almost smile she had first learned to watch for, but the real one that had taken months to earn and that she had still not quite gotten used to in its entirety. The winter passed with the particular intensity of a household that has added a new person, the sleepless nights and the adjustments and the extraordinary ordinary moments that accumulate into something indescribable. Emmett took the night shifts with a willingness that Kate had not expected and which moved her considerably. He would sit in the old rocking chair by the fire with the baby, who was named Patrick but who was already being called Pat, and she would hear him talking in a low voice, telling the baby very seriously and quietly about farming and about the stars and about everything he knew, and she would lie in bed listening and feel the particular kind of happiness that is too large to hold without some grief inside it. By the time Pat was 3 months old, Kate had resumed her full work on the farm, which Emmett had attempted once to gently suggest she might not need to rush, and which suggestion she had received with the exact expression that had made Rudd's horse step backward, and he had not suggested it again. They worked it together as they worked everything, each taking what needed taking, adjusting and supporting without making it an argument about who was doing more. Thomas came to visit in April of 1883. He rode out from Cimarron, where he had arrived by train from Illinois, thin and bookish and unmistakably Kate's brother, and he shook Emmett's hand in the yard with the direct and assessing look of a man who loves his sister and had agreed to trust her judgment and was now making his own evaluation. Whatever he saw in Emmett passed whatever test he was applying, because by the second evening he and Emmett were sitting at the kitchen table talking about crop rotation and land law until well past midnight, and Kate sat across the room feeding Pat and listening, and felt something warm and complete settle in her chest. Thomas held Pat with the careful uncertainty of a man who has not held many babies and said, "He looks like Pa," and Kate looked and decided that was true, and it was a gift to see her father's eyes in her son's face. Thomas stayed 10 days, and when he left he told Kate privately that Emmett was a good man and that she had chosen well, and Kate said she was aware of that, and Thomas smiled and said, "I know you are. I just wanted to say it." The years moved as years do in the Oklahoma Territory, not slowly and not quickly, but with a weight and momentum that is particular to a place where the land demands everything and gives back accordingly. The farm grew. They added acreage to the east where a neighboring family had moved on, good land that Emmett had identified as having excellent soil composition, and they worked it into the operation gradually and carefully. Their yields improved every season as their understanding of the land deepened. They became known in Millhaven and in Cimarron as reliable and productive farmers, which was the kind of reputation in that world that mattered most. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1884, and they named her Margaret Clara, for Ben Purcell's wife, and for Clara Harper, both of whom had been present for things that deserved to be honored. She came into the world with considerably more efficiency than Pat had, and was from the beginning a person of strong opinion, which both her parents recognized and found entirely unsurprising given their combined natures. Pat, at 18 months, received his sister with the magnanimous confusion of a toddler confronted with a competing claim on the world's attention, and within a week had revised his position to one of proprietary affection that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their childhood, protective and occasionally bossy, and essentially devoted. The house grew too. Emmett built a new room that winter and expanded the kitchen, and put a proper covered porch along the full front of the house, the kind of porch that invited sitting and looking out at the land in the evenings. Kate planted a kitchen garden that was large enough to be called ambitious, and that produced through the growing season more than they needed, which meant there was always something to share with the Harpers and the Purcells when times were tight for them, and times were sometimes tight for everyone on the frontier. In the autumn of 1885, a letter arrived from Galveston. It was from Emmett's sister, whose name was Ruth, and who had been corresponding with Emmett through careful and occasional letters since the previous year when Emmett had finally sent her his location and told her something of how his life had come to be what it was. Ruth's letter said that she and her husband were considering a move, that Galveston was not what they had hoped, and that they had been thinking about Oklahoma Territory, about land, about the life that Ruth remembered from her childhood on her father's farm, before everything had gone wrong. Emmett came to Kate with the letter and gave it to her to read without preamble. She read it and handed it back to him. "You should write her immediately," she said. He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "Family is not something to be cautious about when you have a chance to hold it." He wrote that evening, and the correspondence that followed was frequent and warm, and within 6 months Ruth and her husband Daniel, who was a carpenter by trade, had made the journey and arrived in Millhaven with a wagon full of belongings and Ruth's particular combination of her brother's dark eyes and a warmth that was entirely her own. They bought a small claim 3 miles south of Kate and Emmett's farm, and Daniel's carpentry skills proved as useful in that country as any farming knowledge, and within a year they were established, and the two families existed in the comfortable and mutual orbit of people who are genuinely glad to have each other nearby. Ruth and Kate, who might by temperament have been wary of each other, discovered instead a mutual directness and practicality that made their friendship easy and honest. They were not the same and did not pretend to be, but they respected each other's differences with the unsentimental appreciation that frontier women developed for genuine competence in all its forms. On a November evening in 1886, Kate and Emmett sat on their porch as they had sat together so many times, the covered porch he had built looking out over the land that had been her father's and was now theirs together. Pat was 4.5 and had been put to bed with some argument. Margaret was 2 and had been asleep for an hour. The stars were extraordinary, the way they were sometimes in the Oklahoma Territory when the sky was completely clear, and there was no moon and the darkness was absolute, and the farm stretched out before them silent and breathing. Kate was thinking about her father, which she did sometimes in the evenings, not with grief anymore but with a kind of grateful conversation, as if he were still present somewhere nearby, watching. She thought about what he would have said about the farm now, about the new acreage and the improved yield and the proper porch and the 2 children sleeping inside. She thought he would have been satisfied in the deep, quiet way that he had always been satisfied by things that were well made and honestly earned. She looked at Emmett beside her. He was looking at the stars in the way he had looked at that first sunset, the particular quality of his attention that she had learned over years to read, the stillness of a man who is present in the moment and not somewhere else. He had changed in 5 years, and so had she. He had grown into the farm and into himself here in a way that had added something to him without taking anything away, had filled in what the drifting years had worn thin. She thought he was more himself than he had been when he arrived on her road with his worn-out boots, and his bedroll, and his dark eyes, and his cautious truth-telling. And she was glad to have been the ground that steadiness had taken root in. He turned and found her looking at him. "What?" he said. "I'm thinking about something," she said. "You're always thinking about something." "I'm thinking that you told me something at the harvest," she said. "The first harvest, that you had no land and no name but 2 good hands." "I remember," he said. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that you were wrong about the name. Bristol is a very good name. My children have it. I have it." She paused. "And the land." She looked out at the dark fields. "It's yours as much as mine." He was quiet for a moment. When she looked back at him, his expression was the open, unguarded one she had first seen on that harvest night, the one that still caught her sometimes when she was not braced for it. "I know," he said. "I have known that for a long time." He reached over and took her hand. "I just needed you to say it." She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight. This man who had walked up her road with nothing, and had given everything without making a performance of it. This stubborn and honest and capable man who had turned out to be exactly what the farm needed, and exactly what she needed, and who had been patient enough to wait for her to be ready to know it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Patrick would have liked you," she said. Her father's name said simply, without the heaviness it had once carried. "I hope so," Emmett said. "I would have liked to know him." They sat in the quiet for a long while, the November cold settling around them, the farm breathing in the dark, and nothing more needed to be said because everything that mattered had been said, or was being said in the simple fact of them sitting there together, which was not nothing but was in fact everything, the whole weight and warmth of a life deliberately built by 2 people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and their hearts honest. Inside the house, Pat stirred in his sleep and called out something unintelligible, and then was quiet again. Margaret's small breathing was a steady pulse. The fire in the stove ticked as it cooled. Kate thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, standing in the harvest moonlight with a Winchester and a folder full of legal documents, and the absolute determination to hold what was hers. And she thought about what she knew now that she had not known then, that holding what is yours does not require holding it alone, that strength and stubbornness are not diminished by being shared but are multiplied by it. She had been afraid of that for a long time. She was not afraid of it anymore. In the spring of 1887, they planted the largest crop they had ever attempted, corn and wheat, and a new section of sorghum that Emmett had argued for on the grounds of diversification, which was a word he used with the precision of a man who understood its importance from experience. The spring rains were generous, and the soil responded with the uncomplicated productivity of good land well managed. And by June, it was clear that the season was going to be the best the farm had seen. Kate walked the rows in the early mornings the way she had always done, and sometimes Pat came with her now, 4.5 years old and very serious about everything, asking questions about soil and seeds with the concentrated interest of a child who has grown up understanding that the land is what sustains everything. She answered his questions with full attention, because she believed in answering children's questions fully, and because his questions were often very good ones. Emmett sometimes came with them on those morning walks, and the 3 of them moved through the green rows in the early light, Kate explaining and Pat questioning, and Emmett occasionally adding something that completed an answer or turned it in a new direction. And those mornings were among the finest moments of Kate's life, simple and layered and entirely real. Gerald Hooper retired from the First National Bank of Cimarron in the summer of 1887, and his replacement came out to introduce himself, a younger man named Douglas Pierce who was from Boston and who looked at Kate's farm records with visible admiration. "Miss Doyle," he started, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Bristol, I apologize. Your farm has an exceptional record, quite remarkable yield improvement over 5 years." "It's a good farm," Kate said simply. "It's more than that," Pierce said. "The level of soil management and crop rotation is exceptional for this territory." Kate thanked him and offered him coffee, and he spent an hour at her kitchen table being very enthusiastic about the future of agricultural development in the Oklahoma Territory. And she listened with interest and thought that perhaps some of his ideas were worth considering. She had always known that the land could do more than it was being asked to do. It was only a matter of having enough time and enough stability to explore that, and both of those things were now present. She discussed Pierce's visit with Emmett that evening, and they talked late into the night about what could be done with the east acreage in particular, and by the end of the conversation had sketched a plan for the next 3 seasons that excited her in the particular way that a well-made plan excites a person who knows how to execute one. The summer turned golden, and the harvest that year was exceptional, the corn heavy and the wheat thick, and the sorghum performing exactly as Emmett had predicted. They brought it in over 2 weeks with Harper and Purcell help as always, and this time with Daniel and Ruth's help as well. And the harvest celebration at the end of it was large and warm and full of the particular joy that comes from a community of people who have worked hard together and produced something real. Ruth brought her firstborn, a baby girl named Anna, who was 4 months old and regarded the world with enormous interested eyes, and Kate held her and thought about Margaret, who was 3 now and running everywhere and saying everything with great confidence. And she thought about the next generation of this country, all the lives being built on the frontier, all the families planting their roots in this difficult and beautiful ground. By the autumn of 1887, the farm that Patrick Doyle had built was a thriving and prosperous operation, debt-free and growing, situated on land that was now properly documented and legally protected and surrounded by a community of people who had learned over 6 years to depend on the Bristols and be depended upon in return. The 2 children were healthy and loved. The house was full. The fields were productive. The porch was exactly right for sitting on in the evenings. Emmett Bristol had come to this farm as a drifter with a dark past and 2 good hands, and had stayed as a husband and a father and a farmer and a partner. And none of those things had canceled out the others, but had built on them the way good work builds, each thing making the next thing more possible. Kate Bristol, who had been Kate Doyle, had held on to what her father built through sabotage and drought and the particular loneliness of a woman determined to manage alone, and had discovered that the moment she chose to stop managing alone, everything had not collapsed but had expanded in ways she would not have been able to imagine when she was standing in her yard with her arms crossed, watching a lean drifter walk up her road in the August dust. One evening late in October, when the harvest was done and the children were in bed, and the farm was quiet in the particular way that things are quiet when everything is genuinely all right, Emmett came out to the porch where Kate was sitting with her coffee going cold and her father's Bible open in her lap. He sat beside her, and she showed him the pressed flower, faded now to a pale shadow of its original color, from the bunch he had left on her kitchen table in the first weeks of his time here. He looked at it for a long moment. "You kept that," he said. "I keep things that matter," she said. He looked at her in the last of the evening light. "Kate," he said, with the particular weight he sometimes put into her name. "Emmett," she said in the same way, and that was sufficient, because some things between people who have lived deeply together do not require more words than a name. He reached over and closed the Bible gently and took her hand, and they sat in the last warm light of the October evening watching their land breathe. And the stars came out one by one over the Oklahoma Territory, and the farm held them as the farm holds everything that is planted in it with sufficient care and sufficient love, completely, permanently, and without apology. They had many more seasons together. The farm grew, and the children grew, and the years accumulated with the particular richness that only comes from living in full honesty with another person and with the land. Pat grew tall and serious, and was already at 6 showing the same focused competence his father had brought to everything. Margaret grew fearless and inventive, and had recently taught herself to ride with a confidence that made her parents both very proud and occasionally very anxious. Ruth and Daniel added 2 more children. The Harpers and the Purcells remained the good neighbors and genuine friends they had always been. Clem Rudd never returned to bother anyone. His legal and financial troubles in Cimarron had ultimately occupied him thoroughly enough that the Doyle farm, or the Bristol farm as it was now known, had passed entirely out of his calculations. Justice had moved slowly, as it often did, but it had moved. In the spring of 1889, when Kate was 33 and the Oklahoma Territory was changing rapidly around them, with land rushes and new settlements, and the territory pressing toward the statehood it would eventually achieve, she and Emmett stood together at the edge of the south field in the early morning light and looked at what they had made. The corn was coming in. The wheat was up. The new east acreage was planted and doing well. Pat was helping with the irrigation and doing it competently. Margaret was gathering eggs with the efficiency of someone who has done it 100 times. "My father would be satisfied," Kate said. "More than satisfied," Emmett said. She turned to look at him. He was 40 now, or near enough, and the years were in his face in the way she had noticed years coming into it gradually, giving it more rather than taking away, the way some faces work. He was still steady. He was still honest. He was still the most stubborn man she had ever encountered in her life, and she was deeply grateful for every year of that stubbornness. "You know," she said, "when you walked up my road in August of 1881 with your bedroll and your worn boots, I thought you were going to be temporary." "I know you did," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "You were," he agreed, and there was the full smile. She stepped toward him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the morning light with the Oklahoma Territory spreading out around them, all that vast and demanding and endlessly generous land, and the farm that 2 people had built not from ease or luck or inherited advantage, but from stubbornness and honesty, and 2 good hands working steadily alongside each other, day after day, season after season, year after year, until they had made something that would stand long after them. Rooted in the ground and in the children growing up in the middle of it, real and lasting and entirely theirs. The story of the Doyle farm and the Bristol family would be told in Millhaven for many years afterward, told the way good stories are told in small communities, in pieces and from different angles. The part about the sabotage and the kerosene and the legal fight, the part about the drifter who showed up and stayed, the part about the harvest when he told her he had no land and no name but 2 good hands. People who had known them in those early years, and people who had only heard the story second-hand, all agreed on one thing, which was that it was exactly the kind of story the Oklahoma Territory produced when its people were at their best, when stubbornness and honesty and the willingness to work hard for something worth working for came together in the right combination. Kate and Emmett Bristol did not think of their story as a legend. They thought of it as their life, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.